The night Eleanor heard the clock stop. The rain had been falling over Eldermere since late afternoon. Not loudly, not with the sharp violence of a summer storm, but gently, patiently. The sort of rain that seemed content to remain for hours, resting softly upon rooftops and narrow cobblestone streets, sliding down old window panes and silver threads, while the town settled deeper and deeper into the quiet rhythms of autumn. By 10:30, most of the lamps along Hollow Street had already gone dark. The baker's shutters were closed. The tailor's sign swayed faintly in the wind. And beyond the sleeping town, above rows of crooked chimneys and mist-covered roofs, the old clock tower stood watch beneath the rain. Its 4 pale faces glowed dimly through the fog. Ancient hands moving steadily forward, as they always had, as they always were expected to. Inside the small stone cottage at the base of the tower, Eleanor Vale sat beside the fire with a blanket folded across her knees and a book resting unopened in her lap. The fire crackled softly. A kettle murmured near the stove. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows, the town bells prepared themselves for the 11th hour. Eleanor had lived in Eldermere for only 12 days. 12 quiet, rain-scented days since arriving from London after receiving the letter informing her that her great-uncle, Arthur Vale, had passed peacefully in his sleep. She had not seen him in nearly 10 years.
Not since childhood summers spent wandering the tower stairs while he polished brass mechanisms and wound the enormous clockworks hidden high above the town. Back then, the tower had felt enormous, endless, filled with secrets. Now, at 28, Eleanor found it smaller than memory had promised, and lonelier. The cottage itself carried the stillness of a place that had belonged to one person for a very long time. Nothing had changed since Arthur's passing. His spectacles still rested beside the armchair. His tea tin remained carefully folded shut. Even the umbrella near the door still carried faint droplets from what must have been his final walk through town. Eleanor had not moved very much. It felt wrong somehow.
As though the cottage had not yet realized its owner was gone. The only creature who seemed entirely undisturbed by the change was the cat. He slept near the fireplace now, curled into a soft gray and white circle upon the faded rug, one ear twitching occasionally at the sound of rain. Arthur had mentioned the cat in letters over the years, briefly, always casually. The tower cat is becoming old. The tower cat stole sausage again. The tower cat disapproves of visitors. Never a name. Only the tower cat. But the townspeople had supplied one almost immediately after Eleanor arrived. Orion. No one seemed to know exactly when he had first appeared. Only that he had been there for many years, watching, waiting.
Existing beside the tower as naturally as the bells themselves. Eleanor glanced toward him now. "Comfortable?" she asked softly. The cat did not open his eyes. The fire popped quietly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows like careful fingertips. Then, from above the town, the first bell began to ring. Deep, heavy, ancient. Eleanor listened as the sound rolled through Eldermere. One bell, then another, steady and familiar. The tower announcing the hour to sleeping streets and empty alleyways below. 3, 4, 5. She leaned back slightly in the chair,
listening to the old rhythm Arthur had tended for most of his life. 6, 7. The rain continued softly. 8, 9, 10. And then, silence. Eleanor blinked. The 11th bell never came.
For a moment, the cottage seemed strangely still, as though the entire town had paused to listen. Even the fire had quieted. Eleanor waited. Surely the final bell would sound. The mechanism was old, yes, but the clock tower had stood for more than a century. Arthur had maintained it obsessively. Every gear polished, every spring checked twice. Yet no final bell came. Only rain. Soft rain against glass. Then Orion lifted his head. Slowly. His pale eyes turned toward the ceiling, toward the tower above them. Eleanor felt a small chill pass through her. The cat rose carefully onto all fours, not startled, not frightened, simply attentive, as though he had heard something. A moment later, Eleanor heard it too. Footsteps. Very faint. Somewhere above the cottage ceiling. Slow footsteps climbing the spiral stairs inside the tower. One step at a time. Wood creaking softly beneath unseen weight. Eleanor sat completely still, listening. The tower should have been empty. No one had entered. She would have heard the outer door. The footsteps continued upward. Steady. Measured. Not hurried. Orion walked silently toward the cottage door. His tail low. Eyes fixed upward. The fire crackled behind them. Eleanor set the blanket aside carefully and stood. The sound above continued. Another step. Then another. The old staircase winding upward into darkness. Her uncle had once told her that the tower carried sounds strangely during rainstorms. Perhaps that was all this was. Old wood settling.
Pipes groaning. Echoes from the street. But even as Eleanor tried to reassure herself, she found her pulse quickening. Orion sat beside the door now, waiting. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the cottage once more. Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath. Then, far above, a single light appeared through the narrow tower window. A lantern, burning high inside the clock tower. Eleanor stared upward through the rain-streaked glass. She was certain the tower had been dark moments earlier. Yet now, a faint amber glow moved slowly behind the fogged window panes near the bells. The cat gave a low sound in his throat. Not quite a meow. Almost recognition. Did someone go up there? Eleanor whispered. Orion only watched the tower. Rain drifted softly against stone.
The lantern glow moved once, then became still. Eleanor hesitated. Every sensible part of her insisted she remain inside the warm cottage until morning. But curiosity is a quiet and stubborn thing, especially in lonely places. And Eldermere already felt full of questions. So she reached for Arthur's lantern hanging beside the door. The brass felt cool beneath her fingers. Orion waited beside her as though expecting this exact decision. "You're not helping," she murmured gently. The cat blinked once. Together, they stepped into the rain. The cold air smelled of wet stone and chimney smoke. Mist drifted across Hollow Street in pale ribbons. Above them, the clock tower disappeared into fog. Only the glowing lantern window remained visible. Eleanor crossed the small courtyard toward the tower entrance. Rain tapped softly against the hood of her coat. The heavy wooden door stood closed. She placed one hand against it. The iron handle was damp and freezing cold. For a moment, she simply listened. Nothing. No footsteps now, no voices. Only distant rain and the quiet hiss of wind moving between buildings. Slowly, Eleanor pushed the door open. The spiral staircase beyond curved upward into darkness. Stone walls glistened faintly with moisture. The air smelled of old wood, oil, and metal. And somewhere far above, hidden beyond shadows and ancient beams, the clockworks continued ticking steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Orion slipped past her into the tower, completely unafraid. His paws made almost no sound against the worn steps. Eleanor raised the lantern higher. Golden light trembled softly across stone walls as she followed him upward. The staircase twisted slowly around the inside of the tower, step after step disappearing into dimness above. Arthur had climbed these stairs every day until the final week of his life. The thought made Eleanor strangely emotional. She could almost imagine him ahead of her now, lantern in hand, moving carefully upward to tend the bells. The tower felt deeply unchanged, as though time moved differently here, lower, softer. The rain outside faded gradually as they climbed, replaced by the steady heartbeat of machinery, ticking gears, turning chains. The breathing rhythm of clocks. Orion stopped at the first landing, waiting beside a narrow window. Eleanor paused beside him. From here, she could see much of Eldermere below. Golden lamps glowing through rain. Thin streams of chimney smoke curling into fog. Everything looked softened by mist. Almost dreamlike. Then Orion continued upward. The second staircase creaked beneath Eleanor's boots. Old wood polished smooth by decades of footsteps. At the next landing stood the clock mechanism itself. Enormous brass gears turned slowly within a framework of iron and oak. Pendulums swung gently. Chains disappeared upward into shadow. Eleanor stared quietly. She remembered standing here as a little girl while Arthur explained how every movement depended upon another. One gear guiding the next. One small wheel keeping time for the entire town. The machinery continued perfectly. Nothing appeared broken. So why had the bell stopped? Orion moved again, past the clockworks, higher still, toward the bell chamber. A faint draft drifted downward from above, cool and damp. The lantern light flickered softly. And then Eleanor noticed something strange. A second lantern already burned near the upper stairs. She froze. Its glow flickered warmly against stone walls. Someone had definitely been here,
"Hello?" Eleanor called softly. Her voice vanished upward into darkness. No answer came. Only rain tapping faintly outside the tower walls. Orion climbed toward the waiting light.
Eleanor followed more carefully now. The upper staircase narrowed sharply. At last, they reached the bell chamber itself. Huge bronze bells hung silently above wooden beams blackened with age. Rain whispered through narrow openings in the stone. The second lantern rested beside the wall. Still warm. Eleanor crouched beside it slowly. Not Arthur's lantern. Not hers. A different one. Old, but recently lit. She touched the metal handle. Warmth still lingered there. Someone had been inside the tower moments ago. Yet the chamber stood empty. No other doors, no place to hide. Only bells, stone, rain, and the cat. Orion had walked toward the eastern window. Now he sat there perfectly still, watching the rain-covered town below. Eleanor approached carefully.
"What is it?" she whispered. The cat did not move. Far below, somewhere beyond the fog and rooftops, a distant train whistle echoed faintly through the night. Long, lonely, almost mournful. Orion's ears twitched. Then Eleanor noticed the small object resting beside the window ledge. A notebook, thin and leather-bound, its cover worn pale with age. She picked it up gently. Arthur's handwriting covered the first page immediately. Clocktower Maintenance Ledger. Below that, November 1887. Eleanor turned several pages carefully. Most entries were ordinary. Bell inspection complete. South gear cleaned. Rain leakage near upper window. But near the back of the ledger, the writing changed. Shorter. More personal somehow. October 14th. Heavy rain tonight. The cat waited again. October 21st. No sign of him. The cat waited again. October 30th. Lantern left burning. The cat waited again. Eleanor frowned softly. Page after page carried similar entries. Always brief. Always ending the same way. The cat waited again. Beside her, Orion continued staring into the rain. Still, patient, as though he had done this many times before. A cold draft passed through the chamber. The lantern flame flickered. And somewhere deep within the tower machinery below, the missing 11th bell finally rang. One deep note rolling slowly through Eldermere beneath the rain. Late. Heavy. Ancient. Eleanor looked upward sharply. The sound faded across the sleeping town. Then, silence returned once more. Orion blinked slowly, and for the first time since entering the tower, he quietly lay down beside the window, as though the waiting, for tonight at least, had ended. Rain on Hollow Street. The rain remained over Eldermere for 3 more days. Not heavy rain, not storms. Only the same soft autumn drizzle drifting quietly across rooftops and chimneys, wrapping the little town in a silver-gray stillness that seemed to slow even the passing of time itself. By the 4th morning, Eleanor had begun to understand that Eldermere was not a place that hurried. Nothing here rushed. Not the bells, not the shopkeepers, not even the weather. Mist lingered long after sunrise. Shop doors opened slowly, and conversations often paused halfway through,
as though the townspeople preferred silence just as much as words. Eleanor stood beside the cottage window, watching the rain slide gently down the glass.
Beyond the courtyard, the old clock tower rose pale against the cloudy morning sky. Its bells had rung properly through the night, every hour, steady, calm, as though nothing strange had happened at all. Yet the lever ledger still rested on the table beside her untouched cup of tea. And every time Eleanor glanced toward it, she felt the same quiet unease return. The cat waited again. The phrase lingered in her thoughts like the memory of a half-forgotten dream. Behind her, Orion slept curled beside the fire. His tail twitched once as sparks shifted softly in the grate. He seemed perfectly content now. Whatever tension had held him during that strange midnight climb through the tower had disappeared by morning. Eleanor envied him a little. She had slept poorly. Not from fear, exactly. The tower itself had never felt dangerous. Only unfinished somehow. As though she had stepped into the middle of a story already years in progress. The kettle began to hum gently over the stove. Eleanor poured fresh tea into a small ceramic cup and glanced once more toward the ledger. Finally, she opened it again. The old paper smelled faintly of dust and smoke. Most entries remained ordinary clockkeeper notes. Repairs, weather, bell timings. Yet every few pages, the same line returned. The cat waited again. Sometimes beside dates, sometimes alone. Always written in Arthur's steady, careful handwriting. Eleanor turned another page slowly. November 2nd.
Heavy fog over Hollow Street tonight. Orion waited beside the eastern window until after midnight. November 5th. Train delayed again due to flooding near Blackmere Crossing. The cat waited again. November 8th. Lantern left burning in the bell chamber. Eleanor frowned slightly. The entries stretched across years, not weeks, years, always circling back to waiting and trains. Outside, the rain softened further into mist. A quiet morning bell rang somewhere deeper in town. Orion lifted his head immediately. Not alarmed, only attentive. The cat stood, stretched slowly beside the fire, and walked toward the cottage door. Eleanor watched him. "You're going somewhere?" Orion looked back once, then sat beside the door expectantly. Eleanor smiled faintly despite herself.
You've become very confident that I'll follow you. The cat blinked once, which Eleanor was beginning to suspect meant yes. A few minutes later, she stepped out into the cool morning rain, wearing her moss green coat and carrying a black umbrella Arthur had left hanging beside the door. Orion trotted ahead across the wet courtyard. The town smelled of rain-soaked stone and chimney smoke. Somewhere nearby, fresh bread drifted warmly through the mist. Hollow Street curved gently downhill from the tower. Narrow shops lined both sides of the cobbled road. Old signs creaked softly overhead. A florist, a tailor, a tiny bookstore no wider than a hallway. Everything looked slightly faded by weather and time, but not abandoned. Lived in, loved quietly. Orion moved with complete familiarity through the town. Several people nodded politely as he passed. One elderly woman, sweeping rainwater from her doorstep, paused entirely to greet him. "Well now," she said softly. "Out early today, are you?" The cat continued onward without slowing. The woman looked toward Eleanor with a small smile. He still checks the street every morning.
Eleanor paused beneath her umbrella. Checks for what? The woman leaned lightly upon her broom.
No one's certain anymore.
Rain tapped softly against nearby windows. The woman's expression remained gentle rather than mysterious, as though discussing something old and ordinary.
My husband used to say the cat was waiting for the 11 o'clock train, she continued. Though whether he meant someone arriving or someone leaving, well, she shrugged slightly.
Arthur used to know.
Eleanor felt the familiar small chill again. Did my uncle ever explain it? Oh no, the woman smiled. Arthur preferred keeping certain stories to himself. Orion had stopped farther down the street now, waiting again. Eleanor thanked the woman quietly before continuing after him. The farther they walked from the tower, the more Eldermere slowly awakened around them. A milk cart rattled softly over wet stones. Shopkeepers lit lanterns inside fogged windows. A pair of children in oversized scarves hurried past, laughing quietly beneath one umbrella.
Everything felt softened by rain. Even sound itself seemed gentler here. Orion finally stopped outside a bakery near the corner of Hollow Street. Warm golden light glowed through steamed windows. The smell of cinnamon and fresh bread drifted warmly into the damp morning air. The cat sat beside the door, waiting. "You certainly know where breakfast lives," Eleanor murmured. A bell chimed softly as she entered the bakery. Warmth immediately surrounded her. Shelves lined with fresh loaves filled the little shop. Copper kettles steamed near the counter. And behind rows of pastries stood a broad-shouldered older man dusting flour from his hands.
"Well," he said warmly, "Arthur's niece."
Eleanor smiled politely. "I'm beginning to suspect everyone in town already knows me."
Small towns are efficient that way.
The baker's eyes shifted toward Orion, now weaving comfortably between wooden tables. And naturally, he's brought you here.
"You know him too?"
The baker laughed softly. Everyone knows Orion. He leaned slightly closer. That cat's stolen sausages from this bakery for at least 10 years. Orion ignored the accusation completely. The baker reached beneath the counter and produced a tiny piece of smoked ham anyway. The cat accepted it with complete dignity. "You see," Eleanor said quietly, "you encourage him." "Of course I do." The baker smiled. "Arthur always claimed the tower belonged to the cat more than the rest of us." Rain whispered softly against the windows behind them. Eleanor hesitated briefly before speaking again.
"Did Arthur ever mention why Orion waits by the tower window at night?" The baker's hands slowed slightly. For the first time, his cheerful expression softened into something more thoughtful. "He still does that?" Eleanor nodded. The baker glanced toward the rain outside. For several seconds, only the kettle hissed softly between them. Then he spoke carefully. "Years ago, before your uncle became ill, the cat used to walk to the railway station every Thursday evening. The station? Always just before the late train arrived. Orion had jumped quietly onto the windowsill now, watching the rainy street outside. He would sit there until midnight sometimes," the baker continued softly, "then return to the tower. Waiting for someone? Perhaps."
The baker folded a cloth slowly. No one ever asked Arthur directly. In towns like this, people learn which questions are best left gentle.
Eleanor looked toward Orion again. The cat remained perfectly still beside the rain-covered window, watching Hollow Street, as though listening for something very far away. The baker wrapped 2 warm pastries in paper and handed them across the counter. "For the walk home." "Oh, I couldn't." "You absolutely can." He smiled kindly. "Arthur once repaired my kitchen clock during a snowstorm, refused payment entirely." Outside, the rain had softened, almost into mist. Eleanor thanked him and stepped back onto Hollow Street, with Orion following close behind. The town seemed quieter now.
The morning rush already fading into Eldermere's usual slow rhythm. As they walked uphill again, Eleanor noticed something peculiar. Every few minutes, Orion paused beside certain places. A green bench near the florist, a narrow alley beside the tailor shop, the old gas lamp outside the post office. Each time, he stopped only briefly, watching, waiting, then continuing onward, almost like following a routine memorized long ago. At last, he stopped near the far end of Hollow Street, beneath a rusted iron sign swinging gently in the rain. The sign read, Eldermere Station Road. Beyond it, the road curved downward into thicker fog. Eleanor stared quietly. "So that's where you used to go." Orion sat beside the sign, his pale amber eyes fixed somewhere beyond the mist. Far away, almost hidden beneath rain and distance, came the faint sound of a train whistle. Long, low, lonely. The cat's ears lifted immediately. Eleanor felt something tighten softly inside her chest. Not fear, only sadness, perhaps, or patience. The sort of quiet feeling old places sometimes carried. After a long moment, Orion finally stood. Together, they turned back toward the tower. By late afternoon, the rain grew heavier again. Drops tapped steadily against the cottage windows, while Eleanor sat near the fire, reading more of Arthur's ledger. Outside, fog wrapped itself around the tower walls. The bells rang softly overhead. Orion slept beside the hearth once more. Yet even asleep, one ear twitched each time distant train whistles drifted faintly through the rain. Eleanor turned another page carefully. Most entries remained familiar. Clock repairs, weather notes, train delays. Then suddenly, near the bottom of one yellowed page, something small slipped loose and fell gently into her lap. A key. Tiny. Black iron worn smooth with age. Eleanor stared at it quietly. The key could not have been larger than 2 inches. Strange symbols curled faintly along its handle. Not decorative exactly. Almost initials, perhaps? Orion lifted his head at once. The cat watched the key without moving. Eleanor looked back toward the open ledger. A single line had been written beside the page where the key had rested hidden for years. For the room above the bells. Only when the waiting ends. Outside, rain continued falling softly over Eldermere.
And somewhere high above the cottage ceiling, deep inside the old clock tower, something heavy shifted quietly in the dark. The room above the bells. That night, the rain did not stop once. It drifted softly over Eldermere hour after hour, wrapping the town in silver mist and quiet darkness, while the old clock tower stood above the rooftops like a patient stone guardian, listening to the weather. Inside the cottage beneath the tower, Eleanor Vale remained awake long after midnight. The tiny iron key rested beside the firelight on the wooden table. Every now and then, the flames reflected faintly across the strange symbols carved into the handle.
Orion watched it from the hearth, not nervously, only carefully, as though he already understood something Eleanor did not. The cottage felt unusually silent tonight. Even the clock overhead seemed softer than usual. Tick, tick, tick.
Beyond the rain-covered windows, fog moved slowly through the courtyard stones. And high above them, somewhere inside the tower itself, old wooden beams creaked gently in the damp autumn air. Eleanor wrapped Arthur's wool blanket more tightly around her shoulders and opened the ledger again. For the room above the bells, only when the waiting ends. She read the sentence 3 times. The room above the bells. She had climbed as far as the bell chamber already, but she had seen no room above it, only darkness disappearing higher into the tower. A place Arthur had never mentioned, a place somehow hidden. The fire crackled softly. Orion stood. Without a sound, the cat walked toward the cottage door, then stopped, looking back at her.
Eleanor sighed quietly. You know where it is, don't you? Orion blinked once. Outside, the rain whispered steadily through the fog. Eleanor reached for her lantern. The tower staircase felt colder at night. Their footsteps echoed softly upward through the damp stone passage, while lantern light trembled against ancient walls darkened by centuries of smoke and weather. Orion climbed ahead silently. The cat seemed perfectly familiar with every step. Higher and higher they moved, past the great brass gears, past the swinging pendulum, past the bell chamber where bronze bells hung sleeping above the dark beams. Rain drifted softly through the narrow openings high in the stone walls. The whole tower smelled faintly of wet iron and old wood. Eleanor lifted the lantern higher. Where now? Orion crossed the bell chamber slowly toward the eastern wall. At first, Eleanor saw nothing unusual there. Only stone, shadow, ancient beams. Then the cat stopped beside a narrow wooden ladder nearly invisible against the darkness. Eleanor stared upward. The ladder disappeared through a square opening in the ceiling above the bells. A hidden passage. Her chest tightened softly. Arthur had climbed up there. Many times, perhaps. The lantern flame flickered as cold air drifted downward from above. Orion began climbing first. Slowly, carefully, without hesitation. Eleanor followed. The ladder creaked beneath her boots while the bells below disappeared into shadow. The higher she climbed, the quieter the tower became. Until finally, even the sound of rain seemed distant. At last, Eleanor reached the opening. A small room waited beyond it. Not large, not grand, only quiet. The lantern light revealed sloping wooden ceilings and old stone walls softened by dust and age. A narrow bed stood against one corner, beneath a faded wool blanket. Beside it rested a small iron stove, long gone cold. Shelves filled with books lined the walls. And near the round eastern window sat an old wooden chair, facing the rain beyond the glass. The room felt untouched, as though someone had simply stepped away for a moment years ago. Eleanor lowered the lantern slowly. Oh. The word escaped her before she realized it. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt kept. Carefully. Patiently. Orion crossed directly toward the chair beside the window and leapt onto its cushion. Then he settled there quietly, watching the rain outside.
exactly as though he had done it many times before. Eleanor moved slowly through the room. Dust covered most surfaces lightly, yet certain things appeared strangely cared for. A folded blanket, a polished teacup, fresh lamp oil inside an old lantern. Someone had maintained this room, or perhaps Arthur had, until recently. Beside the bed stood a narrow desk. Papers rested there beneath a brass paperweight shaped like a small clock. Eleanor set the lantern beside them and unfolded the top page carefully. The handwriting belonged to Arthur. If the bells ever stop before midnight, light the eastern lantern.
If the train arrives late, wait until the final whistle. If Orion refuses to leave the tower, open the window. Eleanor frowned softly. The instructions made little sense together. Yet Arthur had written them with calm certainty, like routines practiced many times. Another paper rested beneath the first. This one, older, its edges yellowed heavily with age. Eleanor lifted it carefully. The note was not written by Arthur. She could tell immediately. The handwriting was elegant, but uneven, as though written by someone weak or ill. Arthur, if the weather holds me again, tell the cat I tried. E. Blackthorn. Eleanor stared at the signature. Rain tapped softly against the round window. Orion remained perfectly still upon the chair beside it. E. Blackthorn.
The name stirred something faintly familiar. Then, suddenly, she remembered. One of Arthur's ledger entries. Blackmere Crossing. Train delays. Waiting. Eleanor slowly lowered herself into the chair beside the desk. The room felt smaller now somehow. More personal. As though the silence here belonged to someone specific. She looked toward Orion. Who was E. Blackthorn? The cat merely watched the rain. Far below, one of the tower bells rang softly through the night. Midnight. The sound drifted upward through the floorboards like a distant memory. Then came another sound. Faint. Very far away. A train whistle. Orion's ears lifted immediately. Eleanor stood. Through the eastern window, beyond drifting fog and rain-dark hills, she could barely see it.
A distant line of moving lanterns. The late-night train, slowly crossing the valley far beyond Eldermere. The whistle echoed again through the darkness. Long, lonely, almost mournful. Orion leapt lightly from the chair to the windowsill, watching, waiting.
Eleanor suddenly understood something then. Not everything, but enough. This room belonged to someone, she whispered softly. The cat did not move. She used to wait here. Rain slid gently across the round glass. Eleanor imagined the room years earlier. A lantern glowing softly beside the chair. A woman sitting beside the eastern window watching distant trains through autumn fog. Waiting for someone who often arrived late. Or perhaps never arrived at all. The thought filled the room with an ache so quiet it almost felt peaceful. Below them, the bells continued their patient ticking through the night, time moving endlessly onward. Yet somehow, this little room had remained untouched by it. Orion pressed one paw gently against the rain-covered window. The train whistle sounded once more, then
faded slowly into the distance. At last, the cat relaxed. Not fully, but enough that his shoulders lowered slightly beneath his fur. Eleanor watched him carefully. "How long have you been waiting?" The question slipped quietly into the room. Orion blinked slowly. The fire inside the lantern flickered lower now. Its warm amber glow danced softly across the old bookshelves and faded blankets. Eleanor moved toward the shelves curiously.
Most books concerned clocks, astronomy, weather patterns, railway schedules. But tucked carefully between them rested a small, dark blue journal. Unlike the others, this one carried no dust at all. Eleanor opened it gently. The first page contained only a single sentence: "For whoever remains after me." Her breath caught softly. The next pages were filled not with clock records, but observations. Descriptions of trains arriving late through storms. Notes about weather. Mentions of the cat. And again, one name. Evelyn Blackthorne. Eleanor sat beside the lantern and continued reading while rain drifted softly beyond the eastern window. Arthur's words grew increasingly personal as the years passed. Evelyn arrived during the autumn rains.
Said the tower bells helped her sleep. Evelyn fears traveling during storms. Orion sleeps beside her chair every night. Train delayed again tonight. She waited until nearly dawn beside the eastern window. Eleanor turned another page slowly, then another. The entries continued for years. Gentle, quiet, almost painfully ordinary. And perhaps because of that, deeply sad. Finally, she reached the last entry. The handwriting trembled slightly now. Evelyn did not return this autumn. The cat still waits beside the window whenever the late train passes. I have stopped correcting him. Eleanor closed the journal slowly. The room felt impossibly still. Only rain. Only bells. Only the soft breathing of the old cat beside the window. Outside, fog drifted silently across the valley below Eldermere. The late train had vanished completely now. Only darkness remained beyond the rain. Orion climbed quietly into Eleanor's lap. For the first time since she had arrived in Eldermere, the cat allowed himself to rest there fully. Heavy, warm, tired. Eleanor stroked his damp fur gently. Oh, Orion. The cat closed his eyes. And together, they sat in the hidden room above the bells, while autumn rain drifted softly across the sleeping town below. The woman on platform 9. Morning arrived quietly over Eldermere. Rain still drifted through the town, though softer now. Not the heavy midnight rain of storms, but the gentle silver rain that settles over rooftops and chimneys like a long, tired sigh. Inside the hidden room above the bells, Eleanor Vale woke slowly beneath the faded wool blanket. For several peaceful moments, she forgot where she was. Then, she heard the bells. Deep, distant, patient. The old clock tower breathing around her. Warm lantern light had long since faded, leaving only gray morning light slipping through the round eastern window beside the chair. Orion still slept curled beside her. The old cat's fur rose and fell gently with
each breath. Outside the window, Eldermere remained wrapped in mist.
The valley beyond town had disappeared completely beneath pale, drifting fog. Eleanor sat quietly for a moment, listening to the rain. The room above the bells no longer felt hidden now. Not exactly. It felt remembered, as though someone had finally returned after a long absence. She folded Arthur's journal carefully and placed it back upon the desk. Then she noticed something she had not seen the night before. Beneath the chair beside the eastern window rested a narrow wooden box. Small, dark oak, barely visible in shadow. Orion opened one eye as Eleanor knelt beside it. The box carried no lock, only a tiny brass plate engraved with fading initials. E.B. Evelyn Blackthorne. A strange quietness settled over the room. Eleanor lifted the lid slowly. Inside rested only a few objects. A silver pocket watch, a train ticket yellowed with age, and several folded letters tied carefully with faded burgundy ribbon. Rain whispered softly beyond the glass, while Eleanor untied the ribbon carefully. The letters smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. Most remained unopened. Addresses never sent. Eleanor unfolded the first one slowly. Arthur. The doctor insists the sea air may help during winter, though I suspect he only wishes to give me hope politely. I shall return before the first November frost, if the trains allow it. Evelyn. The handwriting trembled delicately across the page. Another letter. Arthur. I fear the storms this year more than before. The journeys feel longer now. Still, the bells call me. Even from the station, I can hear them faintly through the rain. Another. If I am delayed again, promise me Orion will not wait in the window all night. He watches every train, as though he understands schedules better than the station master. Eleanor smiled faintly, despite herself. The letters grew weaker over time, the handwriting thinner, more uncertain. Yet nowhere did Evelyn sound afraid, only tired and lonely. At the bottom of the final letter, Eleanor found something else. A date. October 18th, 1879. Nearly 20 years earlier. She stared silently at the number. 20 years. 20 years of waiting beside that eastern window. 20 years of Orion listening for trains in the rain. The thought felt impossible. Yet the quiet room around her carried no sense of impossibility at all. Only patience. Orion rose slowly and stretched before walking toward the staircase hatch. Then he paused, looking back at her again. The same look as always. Come with me. Eleanor wrapped the letters carefully and followed him downward through the tower. The bells groaned softly overhead while rain drifted through narrow openings high above the stairs. Below, Eldermere had begun waking. Lanterns glowed behind bakery windows. Shopkeepers swept rainwater from their doorways. Somewhere nearby, a cart rattled slowly across wet stones. Orion crossed the town square without hesitation, straight toward the railway station. Eleanor hurried after him beneath her umbrella. The station stood near the edge of town, beside the fog-covered valley. A modest Victorian building of dark brick and weathered wood beneath a long iron canopy. Steam drifted softly across the tracks. Only a handful of passengers waited beneath the rain this early in the morning. Orion climbed directly onto Platform 9
then stopped beside an old wooden bench near the far end. Eleanor frowned softly. The cat stared toward the tracks, waiting. Again. A station porter passing nearby noticed him immediately.
"Well now," the old man murmured. "Still coming here, is he?"
Eleanor looked at him. The porter appeared perhaps 70 years old, with silver whiskers and a heavy brown raincoat buttoned tightly against the weather.
His eyes widened slightly when he noticed Eleanor. "You're Arthur Vale's granddaughter." It was not a question. Eleanor nodded. "I'm Eleanor." The porter smiled gently. "Name's Walter Finch. Worked this station longer than I care to admit." His gaze shifted toward Orion. "That cat remembers more timetables than most conductors." Eleanor glanced toward the tracks again. "You knew Evelyn Blackthorne?" Walter grew quiet. Rain tapped steadily against the iron canopy overhead. "Aye," he said at last. "Poor soul." He lowered himself slowly onto the bench beside Eleanor. "She used to arrive every autumn on the late Eastern train. Always carried too many books. Always looked half frozen." A faint smile touched his face. And that cat adored her.
Orion remained motionless near the platform edge, watching the fog. Walter sighed softly. She got sick eventually. Lungs, I think. Left for the southern coast one winter and never came back. Eleanor felt the words settle heavily inside her chest. But nobody ever told the cat. The station around them faded into quietness. Steam drifted slowly across empty rails.
Far off, somewhere beyond the valley fog, a whistle echoed faintly through the rain. Walter glanced toward Orion. Every evening for years he waited here when the late train arrived. Eleanor lowered her eyes. He still waits. Aye. The old porter smiled sadly.
The approaching train emerged slowly from the valley fog moments later. Black iron, silver steam, warm lanterns glowing behind rain-covered windows. Passengers moved quietly beneath umbrellas, while the train hissed gently beside the platform. Orion searched every doorway carefully, every passenger, every coat, every face, waiting, hoping. Then slowly, very slowly, the old cat sat down again. The train departed minutes later. Its lanterns vanished once more into drifting rain. Walter stood carefully. Well, he sighed, he'll likely return tonight too. Before leaving, the old porter paused. There's something else you should know. Eleanor looked up. Walter's face had grown thoughtful. Arthur kept one final letter from Evelyn. Never showed anyone.
Rain drummed softly overhead. He carried it with him always. Eleanor's breath caught faintly. Do you know where it is? Walter nodded toward the tower above the distant rooftops. He said the bells would guard it until the waiting ended. Orion had already begun walking back through the rain, toward the tower, toward the bells, toward whatever Arthur had hidden there all those years ago. By afternoon, the rain deepened again. Fog rolled heavily through Eldermere streets while Eleanor searched the hidden room above the bells more carefully than before. Bookshelves, desk drawers,
Blankets. Loose floorboards. Nothing. Orion watched silently from the chair beside the eastern window. At last, Eleanor noticed the old iron stove in the corner.
Its base sat slightly uneven against the floor. Carefully, she knelt beside it. Then, pushed. The stove shifted with a soft scrape. Beneath it rested a narrow compartment hidden inside the wooden floorboards. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Inside lay a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed carefully with dark red wax. E.B. The initials stared up at her through lantern light. Orion stepped down quietly from the chair. For once, even he seemed uncertain. Eleanor held the envelope gently in both hands. The paper felt fragile with age. Outside, the bells rang softly through rain-dark evening. 1, 2, 3 slow echoes drifting across Eldermere. At last, Eleanor broke the seal. Inside rested only one letter. Short. Simple.
Arthur, if Orion still waits for me, tell him this gently. Some journeys become too long, even for returning. But I did try. Every autumn, every train, every mile. And when the bells ring during rain, I shall hear them, wherever I am. Evelyn Blackthorne. The room felt utterly silent. Even the rain seemed softer somehow. Orion stepped closer, slowly. Eleanor lowered herself beside the eastern window while holding the fragile letter beneath trembling lantern light. Then quietly, gently, she began reading it aloud to the old cat beside her. Outside, evening settled over Eldermere once more. And far below the tower, somewhere through drifting rain and endless fog, the distant whistle of the late train echoed softly across the valley.
The letter beneath the bells. The rain had changed its voice by nightfall. Earlier, it had been sharp and restless, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers searching for something forgotten. Now it was softer, slower, almost like it had accepted it would not be answered. Inside the room above the bells, Eleanor Vale sat beside the eastern window with the final letter resting in her hands. The lantern had burned low, its flame no longer strong and golden, but quiet and steady, like it too had grown tired of fighting the dark. Orion was still, not asleep, not awake in the usual way either, just present, like a thought that refused to leave. Eleanor read the last line again, though she already knew it by heart. Some journeys become too long, even for returning. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Outside, Eldermere lay beneath fog so thick, it seemed the town had been erased and rewritten in softer ink. Only the clock tower remained fully real. Stone, iron, memory. Everything else felt temporary. Eleanor lowered the letter slowly onto Arthur's desk. For a long time, she did not move. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because everything she thought she knew about waiting had quietly changed shape inside her. Orion finally stood. He walked toward the eastern window. Slow steps. Careful steps. The kind of movement that belonged to something carrying a long history.
Eleanor watched him. "You knew her," she whispered. Orion did not turn,
but he did not need to. Some answers were never meant to be spoken aloud. They were meant to be felt. Eleanor rose slowly and came to stand beside him. The window reflected them both faintly. Woman and cat, human and memory, present and past, sharing the same quiet frame. "She never came back," Eleanor said softly. Her voice did not break. It didn't need to. The truth had already done its breaking long ago. Orion blinked once. Slow. Heavy. Like a door closing without sound. Below them, somewhere in the depths of the clock tower, the bells shifted slightly in their silence. Not ringing. Not yet. Just aware. Eleanor turned back toward the room.
Arthur's desk, the hidden compartment beneath the stove, the letters, the watch, the waiting that had outlived the people it belonged to. It no longer felt like mystery. It felt like inheritance. Not of objects, but of time itself. She crossed the room and gently placed the final letter inside the wooden box where the others had been found. Then, she closed it. Not as an ending, but as care. A kind of respect for what had been held too long in silence. Orion followed her back without hesitation. For the first time, he did not look toward the window. Not once. The station was no longer calling him. Something else was. Something quieter. Morning arrived without announcement. No dramatic shift. No sudden light. Just the gradual softening of darkness into gray. Eleanor had not slept. Or if she had, it had been shallow, more memory than rest. She stood again by the eastern window, watching Eldermere slowly reassemble itself below. Smoke rising from chimneys. A baker's lantern flickering awake. The first footsteps on wet stone streets. Life returning to itself without asking permission. Orion sat beside her feet, not at the window, not facing the tracks, facing her. Eleanor noticed that, and it stayed with her longer than she expected. "You're not waiting anymore," she said quietly. Orion tilted his head slightly, as if the word waiting had finally lost its meaning. A knock came from below. Not urgent, not loud, just deliberate. Eleanor hesitated, then descended the narrow stairwell with Orion close behind. The shop below the clock tower felt different in daylight. Less haunted, more honest. Dust in sunlight instead of dust in shadow. Behind the counter stood Walter Finch. His coat was still damp from the morning mist. His cap held in his hands rather than worn. "You found it," he said gently. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. Walter looked past her for a moment. At the staircase, at the room above, at something only timekeepers like him seemed to understand without seeing. "She always said the bells remember better than people do," he said. Eleanor leaned slightly on the counter. "I don't think she was wrong." Walter gave a faint, tired smile. "No," he agreed. "She wasn't." A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Then Walter reached into his coat and placed something on the counter. A small brass key, worn smooth at the edges. "This was Arthur's spare," he said, "for the tower maintenance hatch near the top bell." Eleanor looked at it. "I don't think there's anything left to unlock." Walter shook his head. "Oh, there is." He glanced upward. "Just not what you think." Orion stepped forward then.
For the first time since everything began, he moved toward the door. Not toward the window, not toward the past, toward outside. Eleanor followed. The town felt different now. Not changed, just revealed. As if a layer of fog inside her had lifted and settled somewhere else. The clock tower loomed above them. Not threatening.
Just patient, waiting, as it always had. The climb upward was slower this time, not because it was harder, because Eleanor no longer felt rushed. Each step sounded clearer. Each breath felt more intentional. Orion moved ahead, stopping occasionally as if checking she was still there. At the top, the bells waited in their vast stillness. They were enormous up close, older than comfort, older than explanation. The air up there smelled like iron, old rain, and time that had never fully dried. Eleanor stepped into the room. The eastern window greeted her first, light spilling through fog. Below, straight toward the far wall, where nothing seemed remarkable, just stone, weathered, quiet. He sat down, looked up, and waited. Eleanor frowned slightly. Orion? The cat did not move. He simply looked at her again. And this time, she understood something she hadn't before. This was not searching. This was arriving. Eleanor crossed the room slowly, placed her hand against the cold stone wall. Nothing changed. At first. Then she noticed it. A seam. Barely visible. Hidden in age and dust. She pressed gently. The stone gave way. Not with force, but with acceptance. A narrow panel shifted inward. Behind it lay a small hollow space. And inside, a single object wrapped in cloth. Eleanor lifted it carefully, unfolded it. It was not another letter.
Not exactly. It was a small, painted sketch. Faded. Soft. Carefully preserved. A woman standing beside a railway platform. A man beside her, holding a cat. All three looking toward a train that had just left. And beneath it, written in Arthur's familiar handwriting, some things do not end. They simply wait to be seen differently. Eleanor stared at it for a long time. The realization did not come like lightning. It came like rain stopping. Slow, almost unnoticed, but complete. Evelyn had not been erased by absence. Arthur had not been defeated by time. And Orion? Orion had not been waiting for loss.
Kneeling slightly, she placed it back into the hidden space. Not because it belonged there, but because it deserved to rest. She closed the panel gently. When she turned around, Orion was already at the window. Not watching the tracks, not watching the past, just watching the morning. Eleanor walked to him, sat beside him on the wooden floor. For a long time, neither of them moved. Below, Eldermere continued waking. Above, the bells remained still. And between them,
something quietly settled. Not closure, not loss, something softer, understanding. Orion leaned slightly against her leg, not asking, not waiting, just present. Eleanor rested her hand lightly on his back.
And for the first time since she had arrived in the clock tower, the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like enough. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly deciding it had said everything it needed to say. The fog over Eldermere began to thin, not disappear, just loosen, as if the town was remembering how to be seen again. And in the room above the bells, a woman and a cat remained by the window, watching the world return to itself without asking for permission. The clock tower did not ring. Not yet. But it would. Eventually. Not to mark endings, but to remind those who listened that time was never only about what was lost. Sometimes it was about what stayed.